Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning. Before I get started here, if you'd like, the design of this room is not entirely what it should be, meaning that those of you who are seated, if you have the self-confidence to move this direction, it might make some room for people that'll continue to wander in. I wish there was access. If you sit over here, you can actually exit from this side. You just can't get in from that side. So that's something to watch for. Let's see. Pick mute. Ha, there it is. Wonderful. And look, they'll turn these lights off. Isn't that great? I love it when technology works, you know? And thanks to I want to thank a few people. First, I want to thank Alex Simon again for organizing this year's interdisciplinary conference and for encouraging me to be part of it. I'll talk about that in a second. Thanks to Liana for the wonderful stories. For John for setting me up for this presentation, whether he knew it or not. There's going to be some resonance there. And for the media services people for all of their help and assistance in recording today's thing. Okay, as we know, today's theme, tomorrow's theme is society and animals. Alex put out the call. I said, I've got something to do. He said, great. Later, I caught the in Alaska part, and I thought, oh, no, I'm not talking about Alaska at all. But I think that's going to be okay because I teach world history here at UAS. I'm not particularly an Alaska expert of any sort. And an issue, before I get started here today, an issue I want to deal with is sort of a Western versus what's usually characterized as Western versus traditional ways of knowing. As a historian, I'm not really particularly comfortable with that formulation or that opposition, particularly as a kind of binary opposition. When people say Western, what I interpret it to mean really is modern. And modern in the senses of, first of all, post-scientific revolution, adopting a mechanist and materialist view of nature, where knowledge is based on experimentation and mathematical modeling, that empirical logic or scientific method. We're talking about capitalist society, about material resources are allocated and distributed on the basis of market exchange, dynamics of investment, profits, and then reinvestment of profits into more business profit-making ventures. And then third, technological control, using scientific knowledge and capitalist initiatives, bringing them together in a combined effort to control, modify, or dominate nature to a historically unprecedented degree. Now, it's understandable that these processes that we call modernization are often conflated with Westernization because it was, after all, in Northern and Western Europe that the scientific revolution and capitalism were first developed in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was Europeans and North Americans who combined those things into the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, and then spread this through the world through successive waves of colonization, initially 16th through 18th centuries, but then imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century. However, the reason why I don't like to conflate modernization and Westernization is because non-Western nations became and have become major global players of modernization as well. First on the scene really was Japan in the Tokugawa and Meiji eras from the mid-17th to the mid-20th century. Over this period of centuries, Japan became an industrialized, militaristic, and imperialist state in East Asia. In the 20th century, the emergence of the Soviet Union, which is not just a Western state, but is a Eurasian state, including the Caucasus, including Central Asia, and developed a different mode of modernization altogether, which we call state-controlled socialism. And as we all know today, in the early 21st century, the emergence of China and India as the major dynamic capitalist economies of the present, who, at least China, shows no signs of becoming Westernized anytime soon. So for all these reasons, I prefer to pair or oppose modern and traditional rather than Western and traditional, which then leads to my talk today. And I'll get on with it. The subject of Fragments Toward a History of Human Animals in the West, which more concerns traditional ways of knowing in the West than with the modern ones, okay? And please know that these are really fragments. This is not a carefully crafted lecture. These are bits and pieces of things I've picked up over several years of teaching world history, as well as ancillary knowledge I've picked up in my own research in French popular culture, and particularly the popular culture of crime and criminals. And this opening slide that you've been looking at so far, by the end of the lecture today, you'll understand where this image of dog-headed cannibals butchering human flesh came from. Okay? But first, I'm going to start here. A major source of traditional knowledge in the West comes from the Greco-Roman tradition. And in Book 7 of The Natural History by Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman natural philosopher, he devoted Book 7 to man, his birth, his organization, and the invention of the arts. Now, one of the things that Pliny observed was great variations in humans by geographic region. According to nation, which was the notion of race in the day race didn't have a biological connotation. It was understood as a nation, a group of people. According to nation, language, and appearance details. Pliny notes this about flora and fauna worldwide as well, this great variation all over the world. Among human populations, Pliny wrote about such people as anthropophagi, who are humans who are human flesh eaters, ophogenes, who are people whose touch cures poisonous snake bites, androgyny, or people with both sex genitalia and who cross-fertilize each other, monocoli, or sciapode, who are single-footed and use their large single foot to shade themselves, blemi, who are people without necks and who have eyes on their shoulders, pygmies, who are only 27 inches tall, cyclops, who are giants with only one eye, and cynocephali, or dog-headed humans. And there'll be more about that in a moment here. Now, there were more than a dozen additional unusual or odd or monstrous humans recounted by Pliny. Most seem to have come from Ethiopia or India in his accounts, but they come from other distant regions, north and west as well. In other words, locations far from the Mediterranean world that Pliny knew well. Now, the Cynocephalus, or the dog-headed being, stretched far back into antiquity, a creature that was between man and animal, having a share of the features of both, with a complex and ambivalent nature. Originally, Cynocephali were thought to inhabit Africa. In the 5th century BCE, the Greek physician Cteus described them as wise and just men with great longevity. In a certain sense, Cteus was perhaps recalling the Egyptian deity Thot, or Tot, the Egyptian god of hieroglyphics and of the patron god to the priests and scribes who understood that sacred writing. Although Tot is sometimes represented with an ibis head, at other times he is represented with a baboon head. Pliny the Elder, who was a 1st century Roman natural philosopher, considered the Cynocephali human in their use of clothing, but animal in their lack of speech. Pliny also used the term Cynocephalus to refer to the unambiguously non-human baboon, which he characterized as a fierce, biting creature, but he distinguished the baboon from its human variety, okay, which he considered more moderate in temperament. Now, here as a historian, I feel compelled to defend Pliny's distinction between the two kinds of cynocephali, human and baboon. Some of the references I've come across boldly claim that Pliny mistook the baboon for a kind of man. However, Pliny was no dummy. He understood that apes and humans share many features, while at the same time, one remained ape and the other remained human. Here's what Pliny had to say in Book 3 of his Natural History about the resemblance of ape to man. Quote, "As to the various kinds of apes, they offer a perfect resemblance to man in the face, the nostrils, the ears, and the eyelids. They also have mammae on their breast, arms and legs which bend in opposite directions, and nails on the hands and fingers, the middle finger being the longest. They differ somewhat from man in the feet, which, like the hands, are of remarkable length, and have a print smaller than that of the palm of our hand. They have a thumb also, and nail articulations similar to those in man. They most differ from man in the sexual parts only, while the internal viscera exactly resemble those of man." That is, Pliny could distinguish between dog-headed humans and apes as different species of Cynocephalic. Traditional knowledge about humans from Greco-Roman antiquity was inherited by early Christian civilization in Europe, which sought to synthesize it all into a single body of thought. Sometimes it's called the medieval synthesis in the theology of St. Thomas of Aquinas. This is because while the Bible and the monotheistic religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are great on things like commandments, history, and lyrical poetry, they don't really have a lot to say about nature, other than a shared understanding of a creator God who fashioned nature while remaining outside of it. Greek and Roman authorities like Aristotle, Ptolemy, Pliny, and Galen, therefore, provided what the Bible lacked in scientific understanding. Now, what the medieval synthesis, what the theologians sought was order in nature. In fact, the medieval world accomplished great technological achievements based on a solid understanding of nature and the properties of materials. Think of those glorious Gothic cathedrals of northwestern France and Germany. You don't get things like that without a solid understanding of the material world. The traditional Western universe was well designed and it was harmonious. There were exceptions, though, things that fell outside the regular order of things. Comets, for example, hail in the summer, earthquakes, frogs that seem to magically appear when it rains, calves or lambs that are born with two heads, dwarfed humans. Such freaks of nature were considered prodigies, something irregular in the system. And sometimes they were omens, such as when Halley's a comet appeared and Harold was king of England, and soon in 1066 William the Conqueror was going to conquer England. The comet was seen as a prodigy, an omen. But not always omens. Given the story of the fall in Genesis, the idea that nature also made mistakes surprised no one. But by and large, things were harmonious. The stars, the zodiac, the sun moved regularly across the sky, the seasons followed the same cycle every year, and human activity was based around such things, in planting, harvesting, and storing up in the winter. Now, in addition to a harmonious nature, the traditional Western scientific understanding of humans and nature was based on a system of correspondences between the heavens, the earth, and the human body. The differences between things, which is the foundation of study in modern science, was deemed less important than the sympathies between them. At the same time, everything in the universe was organized on a hierarchy known as the Great Chain of Being, from inert and dark matter at the bottom to light, literally spiritual enlightenment at the top. In Robert Flood's The Whole of Nature, viewed as an artistic image here, we see that nature plays an active role as the intermediary between heaven and earth. And it's in this role that prodigies of nature occur. Nature, as she's pulled by one chain, one direction, and another chain, the other direction, not all of her details always come out exactly correct. Now, this notion of science, a science of sympathies and correspondences rather than differences and classifications, flourished for 1.5 millennia in European civilization and only began to shift its understanding of science in the 17th century. Now here we see in later sources, with the spread of Christianity in late antiquity and in the early medieval period, the animal ferocity of the Cynocephalic was being increasingly emphasized of our dog-headed humans. And the Cynocephali came to symbolize the unconverted and the infidel. According to Orthodox Christian traditions, Christopher, for example, who later becomes Saint Christopher, came from an abominable race of giant dog-headed Canaanites, okay? Human monsters who barked and ate human flesh. This race of Canaanites was recruited by the Emperor Diocletian to fight the Egyptians. And Christopher was one of this army in the service of the Romans. However, Christ appeared to Christopher, and Christopher confessed. He regretted his ungodly behavior, and he received Christ's baptism. And as a reward, through conversion, Christopher was endowed with a human appearance, and he devoted the remainder of his life to Christian service as one of God's soldier saints. And so in the Catholic tradition, the depiction of Christopher on the right here from the Golden Legend is more typical. He's still a giant, St. Christopher is in the Golden Legend, but he's lost the dog head. But in the Orthodox tradition, even today, there are still icons of St. Christopher retaining his dog head, portraying him with a dog head. Now, as Europeans' geographical knowledge of the world grew, the location of the Cynocephali also shifted. And also shifted were Europeans' expectations about where Pliny's natural oddities or human monsters might reside. Initially from Africa and India, but now we're going elsewhere, especially to the far north. That was the good with the reference to Scandinavia there. Because the far north and the far west were less accounted for by ancient authorities. This had particular implications for the Cynocephali, or the dog-headed people, who were increasingly depicted as ferocious monsters from the frozen north. This may have been due to late Roman accounts of barbarians from the far north, who, it was believed, due to the colder and moister climate of the far north, were believed to have thicker blood, and they thought that this made them more warlike and rash, as well as inclining them toward being human flesh eaters. The Roman authorities Tacitus and Valius discussed Germanic tribes of Cynocephali, who they thought were ancestors of the Lombards, noting that they were more fierce than ordinary German savagery. And the expectation that Europeans might find human monsters somewhere else in some other corner of the globe was not an altogether crazy idea. For with the European age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, Europeans discovered all kinds of new strange flora and fauna that they never knew existed before. As sailors and merchants returned from their long-distance maritime and overland journeys, these strange creatures were recounted, and Europeans did their best to understand what were sometimes bizarre descriptions. Some of them ended up being hybrid creatures like Albrecht Dürer's armored rhinoceroses. Europeans knew about the African rhino, but the variety of Indian rhino being described was one of having a hard, leathery armor. Now, Dürer combined his understanding of the rhino with his notions of armor, and thus the armored rhinoceros. And the idea that some of these new creatures might be monstrous humans was not so far-fetched either. With the Dutch exploration and colonization of the East Indies, today Indonesia, orangutans were discovered. Now, what exactly did the Europeans who first saw these orangutans, what exactly did they think they were looking at? They're looking at something orange, extremely hairy. They seem to be people with manes of hair. Although the explicit descriptions of human animals that were provided by Pliny were not exactly matched by what Europeans were seeing, there was no doubt whatsoever that the strange creatures were as fabulous as anything Pliny had written about. In a way, the fact that natural oddities were actually being revealed by exploration seemed to, in fact, confirm Pliny's basic observation that there was a great abundance in the variety and diversity of flora, fauna, and human populations or human nations. Besides, Europeans experienced monstrous blending of animals and humans within Europe itself. There are centuries of stories about ferocious beasts in the countryside that attacked people. And after the advent of the printing press in the 15th and 16th centuries, city dwellers in chapbooks and broadsides read about such accounts, even though they no longer inhabited the countryside. Europeans also circulated tales about people who were the progeny of marriage of humans and animals. One such story comes from the Pyrenees region of France, that of Jean de l'Ours, or John the Bear, about a man who was born from the marriage of a woman and a bear. Born in a cave, Jean's bear father had placed a boulder at the entrance of the cave to keep his wife and child from escaping. But when Jean became large and strong enough, he pushed the boulder away, he exited from the cave, and he discovered the marvels, but also the deceptions and betrayals of the human world. Jean demonstrates his worthiness to be counted among humans, however, when he encounters and defeats the devil. The story ends with Jean marrying a young princess, and together they retire to a castle in the forest. There were other stories as well about humans who grew up as savages, such as the history of Valentine and Orson, about twin brother nephews of the Carolingian king Pepin the Short, who grew up in the wild forest around Orleans. Birthed in the forest by Pepin's sister-in-law, Belisante, which was the consequent of some treacherous machinations of the Archbishop of Constantinople, the Frankish king tames and redeems the ferocious Valentine and Orson by engaging them as Christian knights in crusades, against the Saracens, or the Muslims. Related stories were about humans who were the offspring of a human woman and the devil. But in all cases, whether these monstrous humans were the progeny of animals, savages, or the offspring of the devil, there were stories about powerful wild beings, humans whose natural condition was one of separation from God. That is, their natural or diabolical circumstances laid outside of God's ordained social and spiritual order, and they could be redeemed only through penance and salvation. Now, while we might be tempted to dismiss such stories as folk tales, in fact, Europeans believed in strange and ungodly nature of human animals, and this had legal consequences as well, including things like lycanthropy trials of people who were deemed werewolves, which reached its peak in the 16th and 17th century, the same centuries of the witch trials during the age of the Reformation. What were the signs that a werewolf was present? Seeing a wolf with no tail, or seeing a wolf that had human toes or fingers, coming upon a person immediately after an encounter with a wolf, or a human being who was caught attacking people in an area where wolf attacks were thought to be taking place. And there were human symptoms of being a werewolf. Quote, "They are pale and sickly to look at. They have dry eyes and cannot cry. Their eyes are hollow and their tongue is dry. They do not salivate and they are thirsty. They have incurable sores on their legs due to dog bites and frequent falls." These 16th and 17th century cases of the trial of people for werewolves are noteworthy, for they also represent a shift in European understanding of the meaning of the animal-human hybrid. In antiquity, in the medieval periods, werewolf transformations were natural, or the result of some kind of compulsion or destiny, and therefore devoid of purpose. And as we know, someone could still be converted and redeemed, even if they had an animal nature. But now, the human animals, such as the werewolf, are seen as culpable and as driven by specific motives. They intend to harm people. They act out of revenge or to gain money or simply to kill and eat people. In other words, the human animal has become criminalized. And it wasn't only human animals who could be judged culpable of crimes. From the medieval era to the 18th century, Europeans put animals on trial and executed them for their crimes. The principal crime was attacking or killing a person, usually a child or an infant. And these crimes were committed most often by pigs, generally referred as sows, but also by rats and sometimes by bulls. Now, what I find interesting in this is that animals did not have to be human to be subjected to the law. In this earlier age, justice or restoration was achieved by delivering physical punishment against the body of the criminal offender. It didn't matter whether the lawbreaker was an animal or not. If the law had been violated, then the punishment had to be delivered against the body of the offender in order to restore the balance in the community. Now, even in the medieval period, the trial and punishment of animals was fairly rare, although over the centuries, quite a number of records of these trials have been compiled. By the 18th century, with the European Age of Enlightenment, such practices were no longer officially conducted, but could still be employed as a form of popular justice. Historian David Warren Sabine has written about a Württemberg village in the 18th century that ritualistically slaughtered a bull because there'd been then years of famine in the village, and they decided this bull was the one responsible for the famine, and so they slaughtered it as a way of trying to restore the balance. But even as tales and trials of human and animal mixtures declined in Europe, as Europe modernized, they were preserved in fables and folk tales compiled by La Fontaine in the 17th century, Perrault in the 18th century, and the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century. Now, for the most of this period, these tales continued to be an active part of folk culture among the majority of the European population, and only became infantilized as fairy tales for children after the mid and into the late 19th century. Now, we're finally back to our cannibals, and here I'll be wrapping up now. Columbus discovers the cannibal. The word cannibal that we use today was coined by Christopher Columbus upon his 1492 arrival in Cuba. It's fairly common knowledge that Columbus's cannibal was a corruption of the word Carib. The Caribs were the tribal enemies of the Arawaks, the peace-loving tribe who had welcomed Columbus. The Arawaks described the Caribs as ferocious people, and Columbus was convinced he had finally found the Cynocephalic, the dog-headed people. In coining the word cannibal, Columbus meant two things. First, canis, from the root of the word canine, also the root of Pliny's Cynocephalic, the dog-headed people. And to this he added a suffix bal. It's a suffix that means in the service of the great Khan. For by this time, Europeans were well acquainted with the 14th century travels of Marco Polo, in which the Italian merchant sang the praises of the great Kublai Khan, who at the time was the emperor of China, the greatest civilization in the world. In other words, Columbus thought the Caribs were the dog-headed people who were in the service of the great Khan. Okay? Now, the idea that they were also human flesh eaters came from a later voyage, when Columbus was shown a recently abandoned Carib village on Guadalupe, which he was informed included the remains of cooked human flesh. That these people were also anthropophagy, human flesh eaters, that was Pliny's term. This was the connection that Columbus needed to make the shift from simply Cynocephalics to human flesh eaters as well. I wrote in here a little note, don't believe me? Look it up in your Funkin' Wagnalls. And you'll see that cannibal is a word that comes from the 16th century and was coined by Columbus. Okay. Now, quickly, cannibals lost their dog heads and their connection to the Great Khan, but the idea that New World natives were ferocious cannibals, that notion stuck, particularly in the accounts by Catholic and Protestant missionaries as they recounted stories of being captured and tortured by the natives. Okay. In historical fact, though, we know it was the Spaniards themselves who were the ferocious and monstrous humans in the conquest of the Amerindians, a brute fact that did not pass unnoticed among some 16th century European contemporaries, such as the Spanish missionary Bartolomé de las Casas and the French essayist Michel de Montaigne. For Las Casas and Montaigne, the inhabitants of the Americas were people who lived naturally rather than under the codes of civilization. Now, I want to note here, this is a pretty erroneous assumption, as we realize in our more anthropologically informed age, as upon European contact, Central Americans lived under the Aztec Empire, and the inhabitants of the South American Andes lived under the Inca Empire, two of the world's great empires, these aren't people living, quote unquote, in a state of nature. Nonetheless, that's what the Europeans thought. So, are these cannibals good or are they bad? In the 16th century, the answer was not clear-cut. For both Las Casas and Montaigne, while these inhabitants were judged uncivilized in their, quote, natural and savage state, it did not mean for these two that they were without culture. On cannibals or of cannibals, Montaigne argued that the Brazilian cannibals who attended the court of the French king in 1562 in Rouen, France, were more moral and ethical than their European counterparts. They were noble savages whose virtues, morals, and innate sense of justice surpassed the corrupt French civilization in every regard. In one sense, as a man of letters, Montaigne was drawing upon his Renaissance knowledge of Cestius and Pliny, that cannibals, Cynocephali, were not only ferocious, but were wise and just as well. Yet, even in their respective sympathetic portrayals of Native Americans, Las Casas and Montaigne also bequeathed to history a view of indigenous people as exotic, which is its own kind of malady, seen as an exotic, natural antidote to the discontents of modernity and Western civilization. Now, that's not the point of view that predominated, however. During the first wave of European global colonization in the 17th century, and then again in the age of imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the notion that indigenous peoples were human animals and were savages, which was a common, at the time, application of Darwinism. In the latter 20th century, it became understood as a misapplication, but most Europeans in the 19th and early 20th century saw it as a direct application of Darwinism. The indigenous peoples were seen as human animals, as savages, and as ferocious. And we can see this by our continued use of the word cannibal in both popular and anthropological literature of the time. That's what won out. However, the animal versus civilization notion of human society, I argue, persists. I would argue persists, even with my fragments. Even with the trappings of modernity, with the globalization of capitalism and the advanced technological application of scientific knowledge, the descendants of Pliny's Cynocephali, I think, continue to resonate in the Western tradition. Okay, and that's it for my presentation. So I've got like 2 or 3 minutes for questions, if anybody has a question about a slide or anything I said here. If you don't, it's fine too, but. Thank you all very much.